In the darkest chapters of human history, few places awaken as much horror and revulsion as Auschwitz, the infamous Nazi concentration camp that operated between 1940 and 1945 in southern Poland. Auschwitz was the largest of all the Nazi camps and was divided into three main complexes: Auschwitz I, the original camp; Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the enormous extermination center; and Auschwitz III-Monowitz, linked to factories and forced labor. It was in Auschwitz II-Birkenau that most of the approximately 1.1 million victims, mostly Jewish, were murdered in gas chambers. Behind its barbed wire, unimaginable atrocities were committed, and one of the most chilling were the medical experiments carried out in Block 10. Block 10 was a special section of Auschwitz where Nazi doctors carried out twisted experiments on defenseless prisoners. The main person responsible was Dr. Karl Clauberg, who began his criminal work there in April 1943. His central objective was to find a cheap and effective method of mass sterilization. To achieve this, he subjected hundreds of Jewish women to atrocious experiments, injecting caustic substances such as formalin, phenol, and nitric acid into their uteruses. The victims suffered unbearable pain, severe infections, and often death. The cruelty of Clauberg's experiments was even greater because he often performed them without anesthesia. The women remained conscious during the procedures, screaming in pain as they were mutilated. In a letter to SS leader Heinrich Himmler dated June 7, 1943, Clauberg boasted, "The non-surgical method of female sterilization which I have devised is practically perfected." He added that if the research continued with the same results, he could guarantee that a single doctor, with a well-equipped practice and the help of 10 assistants, would be able to sterilize hundreds, even up to 1,000 women in a single day. Another sinister figure in Block 10 was Dr. Horst Schumann, who carried out brutal castration experiments using X-rays. He exposed prisoners' reproductive organs to high doses of radiation, causing deep burns, mutilations, and permanent sterility. Many died in terrible agony from the effects of radiation poisoning. Schumann focused especially on Roma prisoners, whom the Nazis considered asocial and marked for extermination. In one particularly well-known case, a Romani woman named Dina was subjected to radiation that left her unable to walk. She was later murdered in the gas chambers. High-altitude experiments were also carried out in Auschwitz using decompression chambers, where prisoners were subjected to sudden changes in pressure to simulate the conditions faced by Luftwaffe pilots. The freezing experiments, directed by Dr. Sigmund Rascher, consisted of exposing prisoners to sub-zero temperatures in order to study the limits of human endurance. Experimental drugs and chemical substances were also tested. Preparations such as sulfonamides or phosphorus-based compounds were applied to the skin and internal organs, producing burns, infections, and endless agony. The screams of the tortured echoed through the corridors of Block 10. Stanislawa Leszczynska, a Polish midwife imprisoned in Auschwitz, would later recall the shrieks of the women, the terrible pain, the moans of those who lost consciousness that accompanied her day and night. Leszczynska was forced to assist in childbirths for prisoner women, many of whom had been subjected to medical experiments. Despite the atrocities she witnessed daily, she remained faithful to her duty. "Every child had to be saved. That was my goal," she would say years later. Other experiments were also conducted in Block 10, tests with different poisons and gases, deliberate infections with diseases such as typhus or malaria, and exposing prisoners to extreme temperatures and pressures. For the Nazi doctors, the people under their control were not human beings, but expendable test subjects, sacrificed in the name of their pseudo-science. One of the cruelest experiments consisted of leaving prisoners naked outdoors until they collapsed from the cold, and then attempting to revive them in various ways, such as immersing them in very hot water. Many died during these trials, and their bodies ended up thrown into mass graves. Among the most feared doctors at Auschwitz was Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, who was fascinated by twins. He selected pairs of siblings to subject them to absurd and cruel experiments. He injected dyes into their eyes in an attempt to change the color of the iris, or sewed them together in macabre attempts to create Siamese twins. Almost no child survived these torments. His obsession with genetics and the idea of perfecting the Aryan race fueled each of his decisions. In an interview published in 1985 by the German magazine Bunte, Mengele's son Rolf described his father as follows. He was so obsessed with science, so convinced that what he was doing was right, that he truly believed he was bringing great benefits to humanity. On one of his darkest nights, Mengele personally murdered 14 pairs of twins by injecting chloroform into their hearts, a crime that reinforced the nickname by which many remembered him, the Angel of Death. The exact number of people who suffered in Block 10 is not known, but estimates range from several hundred to a few thousand. Most were Jewish women, although the experiments also included Romani prisoners, Polish women classified as political prisoners, and Soviet prisoners of war. Many were young and healthy, selected precisely because it was assumed they would better withstand the torture. Others were chosen for specific physical traits, such as different colored eyes or features considered special. Despite unimaginable pain and lifelong trauma, a few survivors of Block 10 lived long enough to tell what had happened there. Among them was Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, a French resistance fighter who later testified at the Nuremberg trials. Her words, filled with unforgettable images, still resonate as a direct testimony of the horror. Another survivor was Vera Alexander, a Romanian Jew subjected to sterilization experiments. In a 1994 interview for the USC Shoah Foundation, she recalled, "They took me to Block 10, and there they started giving me injections. After the injections, I became seriously ill. I had a very high fever and unbearable pain in my abdomen. The pain was so intense that I could not sleep at night." When the Red Army approached Auschwitz in January 1945, the Nazis tried to erase the evidence of their crimes. They executed many of the prisoners who remained and destroyed documents and remnants of the experiments. When Soviet soldiers liberated the camp on January 27, they found a landscape of horror. Piles of corpses and survivors reduced to skin and bone on the brink of death. One of the Soviet soldiers, Martin Oskin, would later recall, "We saw starving, tortured, shattered people. Those were the first people I came across. You could see in their eyes that they were happy to have been saved from that hell, happy that death in a crematorium no longer threatened them, happy to be free. We felt that we were fulfilling a good mission to liberate those people from that hell." Echoes of terror in the execution yard. In the depths of human suffering, few places provoke as visceral a reaction as Block 11 of Auschwitz I, the main camp in the Auschwitz complex. This building, known as the Death Block, was the scene of some of the worst atrocities committed during the Holocaust. Its walls were forever saturated with the blood, tears, and cries of those who passed through it. Block 11 was a place of absolute terror. There, the Nazis applied their twisted idea of justice, brutal interrogations, systematic torture, and summary executions. The building, which originally bore the number 13, housed the camp's political office, the Gestapo, and the punishment cells in the basement. All this stood only a few steps from the deceptive inscription placed over Auschwitz's main gate, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. A cruel lie for prisoners whose fate, in many cases, could only be death. The basement of Block 11 was a true maze of suffering. 4 long corridors lined with cells of different sizes extended underground. The largest cell, intended for mass detention, measured barely 7.8 by 3.8 meters and was known as the standing bunker. Up to 120 prisoners could be crammed in there, forced to spend the night standing in complete darkness without space to sit or lie down. The smaller cells, about 1.5 by 1.5 meters, were used for solitary confinement and torture. Prisoners were placed in them naked, without food or water for days. Many died of asphyxiation, and others lost their sanity due to isolation and constant torment. One of the most feared rooms in Block 11 was Cell 22, the hunger bunker. Those locked inside were condemned to a slow death, consumed by thirst and starvation. In September 1941, a group of Soviet prisoners of war, among them men named Dubinin, Gui, Nikiforov, and Seychov, was locked in this cell and abandoned to their fate. When the door was opened weeks later, only 4 of the 74 men were still alive, surrounded by the bodies of their comrades. The hunger bunker became a common punishment for those who tried to escape or were accused of sabotage and resistance. The yard adjoining Block 11 was the execution site. There, in front of the so-called death wall, thousands of prisoners were shot by SS guards. The first mass executions took place on November 11, 1941, when 151 prisoners were murdered by firing squad. Among those condemned to death in Auschwitz was the Polish Franciscan priest Maximilian Kolbe, who voluntarily offered to take the place of another prisoner sentenced to die of hunger. His act of sacrifice became a symbol of humanity in the midst of darkness. His last words, addressed to his companions, were, "Hatred creates nothing, only love is creative." Kolbe was later canonized by the Catholic Church and became a symbol of martyrdom and self-giving. The Polish prisoner Stanislaw Gresiuk, who survived Auschwitz, left a harrowing account in his memoirs, 5 Years in Auschwitz. From the cells of Block 11 came the heart-rending screams and groans of the tortured, mixed with the beastly roaring of their tormentors. It was a true hell on earth, a hell that could be seen through the small barred windows, he wrote. Gresiuk himself spent time in Block 11, where he suffered continuous beatings and torture. Among the most feared guards, he remembered an SS man named Gerhard Palitsch, notorious for his sadism. He had the face of a bulldog and was always smiling, but it was a smile that froze your blood. If he smiled, we knew something terrible was about to happen. Under the watch of men like him, Block 11 became synonymous with a slow death. The walls of Block 11 witnessed indescribable brutality. Another survivor, Josef Kret, described the methods of the SS as follows. They beat us with rifle butts, kicked us, and set the dogs on us. They hanged us by our arms, tied behind our backs, and left us suspended for hours, then soaked us with cold water. Despite the beatings and interrogations, Kret managed to survive. Later he would say, "I knew I had to live, that I had to tell what I had seen here. That thought sustained me during the darkest hours." Block 11 was also the scene of acts of resistance. In September 1944, a group of prisoners from the Sonderkommando, forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, organized an uprising. They managed to blow up Crematorium 4 using explosives secretly smuggled to them by women prisoners working in a nearby munitions factory. The revolt was crushed with ferocity. 451 members of the Sonderkommando were executed in the yard of Block 11 as a warning to the rest of the camp. Among those executed was Zalman Gradowski, a Polish Jew who had secretly written diaries about the atrocities he witnessed in the gas chambers. Before his death, he buried his manuscripts in the crematorium ashes, hoping that one day they would be found and serve as testimony to the Nazi crimes. Shadows of exploitation in the camp brothel. Within the vast complex of Auschwitz-Birkenau, synonymous with extreme suffering and degradation, there existed a lesser-known but equally horrifying chapter. In Block 24 of Auschwitz I, a brothel was established, known as the Puff, where female prisoners were forced into prostitution to satisfy Nazi guards and certain male prisoners. This place, which operated from June 1943 to January 1945, stands as a reminder of the depth of sexual violence and exploitation that many women endured during the Holocaust. The brothel was created in the summer of 1943 by direct order of Heinrich Himmler. It formed part of a reward system designed to increase the productivity of forced labor. The perverse logic was simple: to offer certain prisoners the promise of a visit to the brothel as an incentive to work harder. In this way, women were reduced to commodities, their bodies turned into tools at the service of the Nazi machinery. In an order dated June 22, 1943, Himmler stated that, to increase prisoners' work performance, a regulated brothel should be implemented in the concentration camps, staffed by women from women's camps who voluntarily accepted that fate. In practice, most of them never had a real choice to refuse. The women forced to serve in Block 24 were mostly Polish political prisoners, although there were also some German inmates classified as common criminals. Many were young and relatively healthy, a trait the SS deliberately sought. Their material conditions were slightly better than those of other female prisoners, somewhat larger rations and less miserable beds. But this was nothing more than a means to keep them alive long enough to exploit them again and again. Selection for the brothel was based on age, appearance, and health. Many women were deceived with false promises of lighter work or even release. One of the most heartbreaking voices about life in Block 24 is that of Helena Pawlowska, a Polish prisoner forced to work there. Years later, she described the experience with these words: "They treated us like animals, worse than animals. They beat us, forced us to do the most humiliating things, and we had no choice. It was submit or die." Pawlowska was only 18 years old when she was sent to Auschwitz. After months of abuse in the brothel, she was transferred to another camp. Her story is just one among hundreds. The brothel opened at night. Prisoners who had received such a reward could enter in groups under the watchful eyes of the SS. Lines formed in front of Block 24 as men waited their turn. The guards collected the vouchers that granted access to the brothel and controlled every detail to ensure that the system worked as intended. The women could be forced to attend to up to 20 men in a single night. The physical and psychological exhaustion was devastating. The tickets for the brothel were purchased with the camp's internal currency, or obtained as a reward for good behavior and meeting work quotas. They entitled the bearer to 20 minutes with the chosen woman. The prisoners had no say in the matter. Their bodies did not belong to them. They were the property of their tormentors. Among those who most enjoyed humiliating the women of Block 24 was Irma Grace, one of the most feared SS guards at Auschwitz, nicknamed the Hyena for her cruelty. Grace took pleasure in choosing the women destined for the brothel, subjecting them to degrading inspections and brutal beatings. She forced prisoners to undress, to parade in front of men, and to endure insults and blows, reveling in the absolute power she held over them. Dr. Gisela Perl, a Hungarian Jewish gynecologist imprisoned in Auschwitz, later recalled how Grace selected the youngest and strongest women for Block 24, combining punishments and abuses in a constant display of sadism. The doctor also described the physical and psychological scars borne by these women, for whom every night was a new sentence. Despite the brutality of the system, some prisoners found minimal forms of resistance and mutual support. Bronislawa Sucha, a Polish prisoner forced to work in the brothel, recounted how the women tried to care for each other and share the little food they had. "We tried to protect one another, to keep our sanity," she remembered. "We talked about our families, our homes, what we dreamed of for the future. It was the only way to keep going." Some managed to pass messages to other prisoners or to disrupt, when they could, the plans of the SS. When the Red Army approached Auschwitz in January 1945, the Nazis began evacuating the camp. Many prisoners, including women from Block 24, were forced onto death marches to other camps. Some survived, others collapsed along the way. Among those who did not live to see the end of the war was Alla Gertner, a Jewish prisoner involved in the Sonderkommando uprising. For her role, Gertner and 3 other women were hanged in January 1945. Her execution marked one of the many silent acts of courage that took place even in a place as brutal as Block 24. In recent decades, efforts have been made to rescue this part of history from silence. Researchers and historians have worked to identify the names and reconstruct the stories of the women who were sexually enslaved in Auschwitz, so that their suffering does not sink into oblivion. Studies and works analyzing women's experiences in the camps have helped to highlight gender-based violence as a central part of the Nazi terror system. The power of memory among shoes and suitcases. In the heart of Auschwitz I, the main camp of the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex, stands Block 4. The building, which once housed prisoners, now functions as a silent memorial dedicated to the lives taken and the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. Within its walls is one of the museum's most moving exhibitions, filled with everyday objects that give faces and humanity back to the victims. The building, originally constructed in the late 19th century as a Polish army barracks, was repurposed by the Nazis after the invasion of Poland in 1939. It first served to imprison Polish political prisoners and later as a storage site for the belongings confiscated from those who arrived at the camp. Every train that reached Auschwitz brought with it suitcases, coats, tools, and personal items that were taken away as soon as the deportees left the wagons. Upon crossing the threshold of Block 4, visitors are confronted with an image that is hard to forget: a huge glass display case filled with shoes. Thousands upon thousands of shoes, piled up in no particular order, stretch out before the visitor's eyes. Each pair represents a life cut short by the machinery of extermination. There are tiny children's sandals, high-heeled shoes, worn work boots, humble objects that were, in many cases, the last things left of those who had worn them. The shoes, stripped from prisoners at the moment of their arrival, speak of their ages, professions, lifestyles, of who they were before being reduced to numbers. The exhibition, first installed in 1955, has become one of the museum's most recognizable symbols. Among the sea of footwear, a pair of red high-heeled shoes stands out, a painful reminder of the grace and femininity brutally annihilated. Nearby, tiny baby shoes evoke the 1.5 million children murdered during the Holocaust. The sheer magnitude of the collection, more than 110,000 pairs of shoes, visually illustrates the scope of the crime. As survivor and writer Elie Wiesel wrote, an entire world can fit into a single pair of shoes. Each pair belonged to a specific person, with family, dreams, and fears, erased by the extermination system. Farther along, the exhibition presents another overwhelming collection, suitcases lined up, each one bearing the name, date of birth, and transport number of its owner. The deportees wrote their details on their luggage in the hope of recovering it one day. Today, these cases, dried out and cracked by time, are mute witnesses to interrupted lives. Names like Olga Kafka or Marcel Spitzer are inscribed on the aged leather, reminding us that behind every number there was a specific individual. These suitcases were found in a storage building after the camp's liberation in January 1945 and were later added to the museum's collection. One of them bears the name Peter Isler, born on August 3, 1926. This young Czech Jew arrived in Auschwitz on September 4, 1943, together with his family. His suitcase is the material link that remains to his short life, a tangible proof of a youth cut short by Nazi violence. Alongside his, more than 3,800 suitcases reflect the diversity of origins, languages, and life paths of the victims. Among them is the suitcase of Vera Vorishkova, a Czech Jewish girl deported at the age of 11. Her suitcase, decorated with colorful stickers and her name written in childlike handwriting, holds all the innocence that was stolen. Every label and every stroke point to a childhood world that would disappear shortly afterward, swallowed by the extermination system. As visitors move through the rooms of Block 4, they reach another famous display case, a mountain of twisted eyeglass frames and shattered lenses. These glasses rest where they were piled up after being torn from their owners' faces. More than 40,000 pairs of lenses are grouped together in an image that encapsulates the massive and seemingly anonymous nature of the killing. Yet, as with the shoes and suitcases, each pair of glasses belonged to someone specific: an elderly person, a teacher, a craftsman, a girl who saw the world through those lenses. The display, also installed in 1955, has become another of the most striking points along the museum route. Amid the metallic tangle, one can make out a pair of fine, light-framed lenses, perhaps once worn by a grandfather. Nearby, thick-framed glasses call to mind intellectuals, artists, and visionaries persecuted by the Nazi regime. Looking at them, it is impossible not to think of the amount of talent, ingenuity, and sensitivity that disappeared in the gas chambers. As the Italian survivor Primo Levi wrote, the memory of a trauma suffered or inflicted is itself traumatic, because recalling what happened is painful. That is why many people try to block those memories in order not to relive the suffering. Block 4, with its display cases and documents, forces us to confront what many would rather forget. The exhibition also includes prostheses, wooden legs, artificial arms, and other orthopedic devices taken from their owners before they were sent to their deaths. One of the most striking pieces is the wooden leg of a Polish political prisoner, Josef Mengele, who lost the limb after being shot during an escape attempt. Despite his disability, Mengele survived Auschwitz and, after the war, became a renowned artist and theater director, using his experiences to create works that spoke of oppression and resistance. On the walls of Block 4, photographs and documents provide additional context. One such document is a list of 999 young Jewish women selected for forced labor in a Siemens factory in October 1942. The list, precisely typed and signed by Dr. Josef Mengele, reveals the cold bureaucracy that underpinned the Holocaust and the collaboration between the Nazi apparatus and major companies. Upon leaving Block 4, visitors carry with them an overwhelming sense of loss. The seemingly simple display cases condense the magnitude of the crime and the necessity of remembrance. As Polish resistance fighter and survivor Władysław Bartoszewski pointed out, the world must know what happened in Auschwitz and never forget it. It is not just a Polish or Jewish issue, but a human one that concerns all of humanity. Life on the brink of collapse in the barracks. In the center of Auschwitz stood Block 7, a building that housed prisoners subjected to living conditions that went far beyond what can be considered human. The structure, built in the era of the Polish barracks, was transformed by the Nazis after 1939 into a sort of prison within the prison, where the already terrible conditions of the camp became even more unbearable. The transformation of Block 7 began in June 1940, when the first Polish political prisoners were locked up there. Upon entering, they were confronted with a scene of overcrowding and filth that was almost indescribable. The building had been designed to house around 200 people, but in some periods it held up to 1,000 prisoners. Wooden bunks were arranged in 3 tiers, and there was barely enough space to lie down. The air was thick with sweat, blood, and excrement. Ventilation was almost non-existent. Primo Levi, an Italian chemist and Auschwitz survivor, described nights in barracks like Block 7 in his works, "Bodies pressed against one another, heads next to feet, like herrings in a barrel." There was no privacy. Every movement, every breath was shared with dozens of strangers. The lack of privacy was one of the most humiliating aspects. The small, overcrowded rooms could hold up to 80 people at a time. The bunks, shared by several prisoners, forced them to sleep shoulder to shoulder in cramped positions. At times, overcrowding was so extreme that some were forced to sleep sitting or even standing, taking turns with others to lie down for a few hours. The Polish prisoner Josef Mengele, incarcerated in Block 7 in 1940, described the scene as a nightmare. People lay on top of one another in 3 levels. There was no room to turn over or stretch out. We were like sardines in a can. Hygiene conditions were virtually non-existent. Chronic water shortages and overflowing, inadequate latrines led to a constant proliferation of lice, fleas, and rats. Food was scarce and of poor quality. A bit of watery soup, a piece of hard bread, sometimes a portion of margarine or a scrap of sausage. These rations were nowhere near enough to sustain people forced to work for hours under blows and threats. There was no real medical care. The combination of malnutrition, exhaustion, and lack of hygiene created the perfect breeding ground for diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and cholera. Hundreds of people died from infections that, under normal circumstances, could have been treated. In a macabre irony, many SS doctors stationed in Auschwitz took advantage of prisoners' illness and weakness to carry out new experiments. In Block 7, as in other barracks, the sick could become test subjects, subjected to injections, operations, and procedures without anesthesia that had nothing to do with healing. Among the stories that emerge from Block 7 is that of Mala Zimmetbaum, a young Belgian Jewish woman imprisoned in Auschwitz in 1942. Although she suffered the same deprivations as her fellow prisoners, she became known in the camp for her moral strength and acts of generosity. She shared the little food she had with those who were worse off, carried messages and news that gave hope, and risked her life to help other prisoners. On one occasion, Mala risked her life to obtain a piece of bread for a hungry child, a gesture that became a symbol of the humanity that could still exist in the midst of horror. In June 1944, she and her partner, the Polish prisoner Edward Galiński, carried out a daring escape, making Mala the first Jewish woman to escape from Auschwitz. They were captured and executed shortly thereafter, but their story endured as an example of courage and love in an environment dominated by cruelty. Another voice that emerges from the barracks is that of Tova Friedman, a Polish Jewish girl who was barely 6 years old when she arrived in Auschwitz in 1944 with her mother and grandparents. Years later, she recalled the constant fear and confusion of those days. "I remember the 3-tier bunks and the crying and screaming of the children," she said in an interview. "It was dark and there was no food or water. We were hungry and thirsty. My mother kept telling me I had to stay silent, make no noise, because if the Germans heard us, they would come and take us away." Friedman and her mother managed to survive, but the memory of those who did not stayed with her for life. The children who disappeared in the gas chambers, those who succumbed to disease or beatings. Among them was Sergio De Simone, a 4-year-old Italian boy used in cruel medical experiments by Josef Mengele. De Simone and 19 other children were ultimately murdered by lethal injections to the heart in the final days of the camp's operation. Sergio's story became another reminder of how far cruelty could go when directed at the most defenseless. The infirmary of despair. In the bleak landscape of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where suffering and death were part of daily life, Block 21 became the bitterest proof of the absolute disregard for human life. Designated as the camp's infirmary, this building housed the final days of thousands of prisoners abandoned to their fate, with almost no medical care, surrounded by filth and pain. The block, built in 1941 as part of Auschwitz's expansion, was assigned in 1942 to function as an improvised hospital. In theory, it was supposed to be a place of treatment. In practice, it was a warehouse for the sick, a place where those no longer able to work were left to die. Weakened, wounded, or ill prisoners were taken there with no expectation other than to agonize for a few days before being sent to the crematoria. The interior of the infirmary was a Dantesque spectacle. Patients lay crammed together on cots covered with straw, infested with lice. Bodies wasted by malnutrition, fever, and infection shared the space with the remains of those who had already died. The stench of decay and excrement permeated the walls. For many, entering Block 21 meant having crossed a threshold from which almost no one returned. Primo Levi described similar scenes in the barracks designated for the sick. People lying directly on bare boards, without blankets, without straw, without food or water. Those who still had some strength were forced to sleep on the bodies of the gravely ill, mixed with vomit and excrement. In such an environment, even a minor wound or a cold could become a death sentence. Real medical care was practically non-existent. The SS doctors assigned to the block were more interested in their experiments than in their patients' health. If there were any medicines, they arrived in ridiculously small quantities and were administered arbitrarily. Operations were carried out without adequate anesthesia, using dirty instruments, more acts of torture than attempts at healing. For many patients, diagnosis was equivalent to a covert selection. Those who seemed too weak were sent directly to the gas chambers. In the midst of this panorama, some figures emerged who embodied moral resistance and compassion. Among them was Dr. Gisela Perl, a Hungarian Jewish gynecologist deported to Auschwitz in 1944 and forced to work in the infirmary. Perl did everything in her power to save lives under impossible conditions. She risked her own, performing clandestine procedures, hiding patients, and obtaining medicines illegally. On one occasion, she secretly delivered a baby and hid it among the bodies of dead prisoners to save it from the eyes of the SS. The child, a symbol of life in a place devoted to death, survived the war. Daily life in Block 21 remained, despite everything, a descent into hell for most prisoners. The infirmary was always overcrowded, with not enough beds, not enough blankets, not enough water. Many patients died without anyone ever writing down their names. Their bodies were removed and sent to the crematorium, where every trace of them disappeared. It is estimated that between 1941 and 1945, more than 1.1 million people died in Auschwitz-Birkenau, not counting those who perished in other camps or during the death marches. The number of sick people who died in places like Block 21 is lost within these global figures, but each one of them was an individual with a life story. As Elie Wiesel said, the Holocaust was not 6 million, but 1 + 1 + 1, irreplaceable human beings. Among the prisoner doctors who left testimony was Eddie de Wind, a Dutch Jewish doctor deported to Auschwitz in 1943. He worked in the infirmary and later wrote a harrowing account of what he saw. He remembered living patients lying next to corpses and beds covered in lice and sores. The sick cried, screamed, cursed, prayed, he wrote. It was an image of hell on earth. His book, Last Stop Auschwitz, became an essential document for understanding life and death in Block 21. Another figure who emerged from the infirmary was the Polish artist Marian Kolodaye, imprisoned since 1940, who worked as a stretcher-bearer. Years later, he captured his memories in drawings and engravings. Skeletal bodies, expressionless faces, scenes of disease and violence. His unsettling, detailed works are a visual cry against oblivion. "I do not paint beautiful pictures," he said. "I paint to bear witness, to scream what I saw." Looking back, everything that happened in Auschwitz, from the gas chambers in Birkenau to the torture in Block 11, the brothel in Block 24, the display cases in Block 4, the overcrowding in Block 7, and the infirmary in Block 21, forms part of a single landscape of death. The accounts of those who survived are a reminder of how far human cruelty can go, but also of the human capacity for resistance. As we reflect on the lessons of Auschwitz, the words of Anne Frank resonate. "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." Remembering the atrocities of Auschwitz does not mean dwelling only on the horror, but learning from it. The memory of the victims obliges us to build a future in which such evil is unthinkable. Thank you for accompanying this journey through one of the darkest chapters in history. May the memory of Auschwitz and of those who suffered and died there never be lost, and may their remembrance guide us so that something like this never happens again.